There are moments in life that divide everything into a before and an after. One side is the version of you that moved through the world with a certain quiet confidence, the kind that comes from never having truly been in danger, the kind you don't even realize you have until it's gone. And on the other side is the version of you that was left behind after something happened. Something that stripped away that confidence layer by layer and replaced it with a wariness you carry every single day. A wariness that whispers in your ear every time you're alone somewhere dark. Every time a stranger smiles too wide. Every time your engine makes a sound it shouldn't. Tonight's stories come from people who know exactly what it feels like to cross that invisible line. People whose ordinary evenings, drives home from work, late nights on the job, a weekend filming trip to an old castle, turned into experiences so deeply unsettling, so profoundly human in their terror and grief, that they stayed with them long after the danger had passed. Long after the wounds had healed. Long after everyone around them moved on. The first story is from a woman who was simply trying to do right by the man she loved. Her boyfriend had been in a car accident, she was picking up extra shifts to keep things afloat, and she was doing the kind of quiet, unglamorous, thankless work that so many of us do when someone we care about needs us. And then one night, on a long, dark stretch of Arizona highway, her car broke down. And a van pulled over. And a man climbed out, smiling. You already know that something went terribly wrong. You can feel it in the air before a single word of the story is told. But knowing something bad is coming doesn't prepare you for how it actually unfolds. It doesn't prepare you for the cruelty. For the way ordinary things, a friendly wave, a joke about cars, the word artist, can carry such darkness beneath them. What these storytellers share isn't just trauma. It's something harder to name. It's the specific, bone-deep experience of looking at another human being and realizing, in a single sickening instant, that they are not who you thought they were. That the world is stranger and darker and more dangerous than you allowed yourself to believe. And yet, and this is perhaps the most remarkable thing of all, every single one of these people came through. Shaken. Marked. Changed forever. But here, and alive, and willing to tell their story so that the rest of us might feel just a little less alone in our own fears. So settle in. Get comfortable. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. We're so glad you're here. Go ahead and subscribe so you never miss a story, and let's begin. Story 1, The Dark Road. Almost a decade ago, my boyfriend, now my husband, was involved in a pretty serious car accident. And while he was in the middle of recovering from it, I had to pick up extra shifts wherever and whenever I possibly could. The only shifts available to me at the time were night shifts at an alternate work site, and getting there required a long drive out into the dark. I didn't mind that at all. If anything, it was that willingness, that feeling of, yes, I'll do this, I'll do whatever it takes, that made me think, wow. I really do love this man enough to build a life with him. But it was also during one of those nightly commutes that I lived through the single most traumatic thing I have ever experienced in my entire life. My route took me through some truly desolate stretches of Arizona. And although I'd always leave with the sun still sitting above the horizon, by about 30 to 45 minutes into the drive, the sky would be completely dark. I hated driving at night. I still do, more so now than ever, because the darkness always brings it back. But back then I was adjusting to the routine, grabbing a bucket-sized iced coffee, putting on my morning playlist at completely the wrong hour of the day, and doing my best to make the long, quiet drive feel normal. But then came one particular journey. One that I remember with a level of detail that never fades, no matter how many years pass. I remember the exact feeling of dread that crept over me when, on an especially deserted stretch of road, my engine started making sounds I had never heard it make before. I didn't know much about cars back then, honestly, I still don't, but I knew that those sounds were not normal. They were not healthy. They were the sounds of something going wrong. Now, being the naive person I was at the time, I didn't pull over immediately. I just kept driving and hoped the problem would somehow fix itself. It didn't. And I don't think I made it more than a couple of miles further before I started to see either steam or smoke, I couldn't quite tell which, rising from underneath the hood of my car. I pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine, telling myself that if I just gave it a few minutes to cool down, it would be fine. I'd be able to start it back up and get on my way. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine just turned over a few weak times and then died. I tried again. And again. Hoping something would magically unjam itself in there. Nothing worked. After letting out a string of words that I won't repeat here, I called ahead to work and explained the situation. My boss wasn't thrilled, but he wasn't furious either. He told me to take care of it, to get there when I could, and to keep him in the loop. I hung up and was just about to dial roadside assistance when I noticed a dark-colored van slow down and pull in ahead of me on the road. A small wave of hope washed over me. Maybe someone was stopping to help. And then the van reversed, backed up so that it was much closer to where I was sitting, and I watched a man climb out of the driver's seat. A wave of genuine relief went through me. Some kind stranger had seen a woman broken down alone on a dark road and had stopped to help. That's what I told myself. That's what I believed. I opened my car door just as the man stepped fully into the light of his headlights. He was wearing a dark jacket and a dark beanie pulled low over his brow. He was waving at me and smiling in this friendly, easygoing way. Arizona nights get cold, especially out in the open desert, so there was nothing unusual about the way he was bundled up against the chill. I thought nothing of it. "Thank you so much," I said. And he replied, easy and casual, "No problem at all." Then he asked whether I was having engine trouble. I told him yes, and that his timing felt like nothing short of a miracle. I was on my way to work and in a real bind. He made a light-hearted comment about how cars always manage to break down at the absolute worst possible moment. And then he told me he was a mechanic, and asked me to pop the hood so he could take a look. Once the hood was up, I came around to stand beside him, peering at the engine like I had any idea what I was looking at. I didn't. There was a brief, slightly awkward pause, so I introduced myself. He said his name was Clay, we shook hands, and then he leaned back in with a small flashlight, studying the engine carefully for a moment or two before saying, in a serious tone, that things weren't looking good. I asked whether he thought he could fix it, or whether I'd be better off calling a tow truck. He said to give him a minute, then went back to it, poking around under the hood before suddenly exclaiming, with this satisfied little sound, "Aha! Now, I have never understood car talk. Not a word of it." And apparently that was written all over my face, because the longer Clay talked about what he thought the problem was, using all of these highly technical terms I'd never heard in my life, the bigger the grin on his face became. He caught himself at one point and asked if I was following what he was saying. I told him honestly that no, not really, and explained that it was normally my boyfriend who handled all of the car stuff. I just drove the thing. Clay laughed at that and mentioned that his wife was exactly the same way. But then, instead of simplifying his explanation so I could actually understand it, he just kept going, more technical language, more terms that meant nothing to me. And here's where something started to feel subtly, uncomfortably off. I know it's hard to put into words. How do you describe a feeling? But the more he talked, the more I got this creeping sense that he was somehow making fun of me. I didn't accuse him of anything. After all, this man was supposedly helping me out of a bad situation, and I told myself I was probably just being oversensitive. But then he used a word that made me stop and think, wait, did he just make that up? I let him keep talking for another minute or so, watching as that grin just kept growing on his face. And then he used another term that was so absurdly made up sounding that I couldn't help myself. I said, wait, are you making fun of me right now? Clay gave me this look. Half injured, half baffled. Like the very idea was unthinkable. And then, just as I was about to apologize for even asking, he said, "Hey." And burst out laughing. He admitted it, right to my face, with zero shame. He told me that the only reason he had stopped was to, and these are his exact words, mess with me. I assumed, still giving him the benefit of the doubt, that now that the joke was done, he'd actually help me with my car. But he didn't. He just kept laughing. Like tricking me had been the funniest thing he'd experienced in years. I asked him if he was even a mechanic at all. And he acted like that was the punchline to the whole routine. He stepped back, bent forward, and laughed so hard he could barely breathe. I had to work very hard not to scream at him. I was furious. So angry I was physically shaking. Because who does something like that? Who sees a woman alone and stranded in the dark and makes the deliberate choice to stop and deceive her for their own amusement? But underneath the rage was something else, awareness. I was a 5'2", 100-pound woman, completely alone on a dark road, with a man who was clearly deriving genuine pleasure from messing with me. Whatever I said next, it had to be careful. So all that came out was, dude. And then I stopped myself, because I knew the rest of what wanted to come out of my mouth would only make things worse. I pulled out my phone. I was going to call 911, report the breakdown and this man who was harassing me. And then Clay spoke again. He said something like, okay. I'm not a mechanic. I'll admit it. I'm an artist. That made me angrier than anything he'd said so far. Because at that point I was thinking, you are standing here, making jokes, while I am stranded and scared and late for work. But then his laughter faded. His hands came up, palms out, like he was preparing to say something. And what he said next was this. I'm an artist. For real, I swear. And he said that he made pretty pictures. Not for a living, just for fun. And then he told me, word for word, that he would make a pretty picture by blowing my brains out all over the blacktop. Everything shifted in that single moment. 1 second he was a laughing nuisance. The next, the air between us turned into something cold and very, very still. Because right as I looked down at my phone to dial 911, Clay reached behind his back, pulled out a gun, and pointed it directly at me. Not so fast. He reached forward and took the phone right out of my hand. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my body stopped working. The sight of that gun locked me in place as completely as if I'd been turned to stone. It was cold out, genuinely, bitterly cold, and my brain had one single message for me, do not move. Do not give him a reason. But still, the shaking started. And it got bad when he said one word. Keys. I was so rattled that all I could manage was, what? He went from amused to furious in a single breath, and shouted, keys. Where are they? I stammered out that they were still in the ignition. And then, after telling me that I was dead if I moved, he reached into my car, took the keys, and threw them out into the darkness of the road. And if you're thinking that sounded like the perfect moment to run, it wasn't. He kept that gun trained on me the entire time. If I had run, I am 99% certain I would not be here to write this. He must have seen the thought flash across my face, the "why did you do that?" of it all, because that grin came back. He told me that in a situation like this, it was better to be safe than sorry. I didn't reply. I couldn't form words. As he slammed my car door shut, he asked me a question, who's going to miss you? I thought he meant the people at work. So I told him that if I didn't show up, they'd call the police. That's not what he was asking. He wasn't asking about work. He was asking who would miss me if he killed me. I started to cry. I thought about my boyfriend at home, recovering from his accident, waiting for me to come back. If I disappeared, he'd never know what happened. He'd wake up in the morning and I simply wouldn't be there. I thought about our future, the one I had been quietly building in my mind. Getting married. Having children. Growing old together. And in that moment it was like my life flashed before my eyes, not just the life I'd already lived, but the future he was threatening to take from me. I told Clay about my boyfriend. About the accident, about how I'd been taking care of him, about how much he needed me. Clay cut me off mid-sentence, yelling at me to shut up and give him an answer, not my life story. I did as I was told. Then he said, "Who else?" So I listed everyone I could think of. Family members. Co-workers. Anyone. I was buying time, hoping desperately that another car would pass by, that someone would see what was happening, that help would somehow come. But it was as if Clay knew that no one was coming. He took his time. Reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small notepad and a pen, keeping that gun on me the whole time, and tossed them at my feet. He told me to write my goodbyes to the people who were going to miss me. I didn't touch the paper. Not even when he yelled at me to get on my knees, which I did. I figured that if I didn't complete his little ritual, he couldn't finish what he'd started. And so all I could think to do was beg. I focused on my boyfriend, on how much he needed me, on how we couldn't afford home care, on how if Clay wanted to take anything from me he could, anything at all, as long as he let me live. I kept waiting for him to yell at me to stop talking. But he didn't. He just stood there with that sick smile on his face. Listening to me sob and plead and sob again. Like he was savoring it. He didn't speak until I finally asked him why he was doing this, at which point he simply said, "I told you. I'm an artist." I don't know why I expected anything that made sense. Nothing about this did. And then, as I was kneeling there with tears streaming down my face, he made that sound with his gun, the clicking, loading sound that you know means it's ready to fire. I shut my eyes. I couldn't look. I just kept crying and begging him not to pull the trigger. He told me to open my eyes. Then worse things. Things I won't repeat here. I tried the same tactic as before, refusing to do what he said, because every second I delayed was another second for a passing car, another chance at rescue. But then he said something that bypassed every rational thought in my head. He said, "Open your eyes, or I'll make sure they never find you. I'll make sure he thinks you just left." He meant my boyfriend. He had zeroed in on the one thing that terrified me more than death itself, the idea that the person I loved would spend the rest of his life thinking I'd abandoned him. I knew I should have kept disobeying. I know that now more than ever. But in that moment, my body simply overrode my brain. I opened my eyes. The smile on his face when I did is something I have seen in nightmares for years since. Jagged and huge and genuinely delighted. My mind has probably distorted the image somewhat to match how terrified I was feeling. I don't think his teeth were actually that awful in reality. But that's how my brain replays it. And it's burned in there, whether I want it to be or not. He told me to look at him. I did. Then he gestured toward his van and said, "Smile for the camera." I looked. I couldn't see anything, it was too dark, or whatever he was recording with didn't have a visible light on it. I don't even know for certain whether he was actually filming or whether it was just another way of getting a reaction from me. But he seemed pleased by my response, because he started laughing again, harder than before. And then, even as he laughed, he lowered the gun. What came after that, I don't remember in full detail. It was a blur of him saying cruel, humiliating things, how pathetic I was, how I'd cried, how he was going to enjoy watching the footage back. Things I won't repeat because they don't deserve to be repeated. I could barely move. I could barely breathe. But I managed one last whispered plea, "Please don't kill me." And he gave me a speech. Not using these exact words, but this was the essence of it: killing me would be less satisfying than leaving me alive. Because leaving me alive meant I would carry this with me forever. The trauma, the nightmares, the fear. That was a far better outcome for him than a quick ending. And so that's what he did. He started walking back toward his van. But not before giving me one last thing to remember him by. He said he was going to make sure I couldn't go anywhere. And I thought, oh God, this is it. He's going to shoot me after all. But instead of shooting me, he ran at me and hit me across the face with the gun. The blow fractured my orbital socket. That's how hard it was. I found out the full extent of the injury later at the hospital. He was trying to knock me out, to make sure I stayed down long enough for him to get away. It didn't work. I fell backward, my head screaming with the worst pain I'd ever felt, but I did not lose consciousness, or at least, I don't think I did. But I knew, lying there on that cold road, what he wanted. He wanted me unconscious and still. So the best thing I could do was exactly that, stay still. Play dead. Give him nothing to come back to finish. I lay there and I begged, silently, with everything in me, for him to believe it. For my stillness to be convincing enough. And I still say a prayer of thanks to this day for what happened next. Because it worked. I heard him laugh one last time. Footsteps on the road. A car door slamming. An engine turning over. And then the van carrying the man who called himself Clay disappeared into the darkness of that Arizona highway. I won't go into every detail of what followed, because much of it is a blur. It was mostly me walking along the edge of the highway, shaking and bleeding and crying, until I saw headlights coming toward me. For a terrible moment, I thought it might be Clay coming back. But it wasn't. It was a real good Samaritan, a man named Gary, who will always be a hero in my mind, who stopped, took one look at me, and called the police right away. Gary stayed with me at a nearby gas station while we waited for the police and paramedics to arrive. I told them everything I could remember about Clay and described the van in as much detail as I was able. And then I was taken to the hospital, where I found out that something in my skull was fractured. And where, not long after, my boyfriend arrived, limping through the ward on an injured leg, helped by a friend who had driven him at a moment's notice. If something like this has touched your life, if you've ever been in a situation that terrified you or someone you love, share your thoughts in the comments. We're all here together, and your voice matters. That moment, seeing him come through those hospital doors for me, told me everything I needed to know. Within 18 months, we were engaged. 8 months after that, once we'd saved up enough and found the venue we wanted, we got married. It helped make up for the fact that Clay was never found. And for a long time, that haunted me just as much as the event itself. I would lie awake, furious with myself for not being able to remember his license plate, not even the first letter, just that generic purple cactus design that's on all the standard Arizona plates. The doctor told me that memory gaps after a concussion are completely normal. That people who sustain head injuries during traumatic events often lose small but specific details. But that explanation didn't comfort me for a long time. I would cry over it. Blame myself. Wonder how I could have been so useless. I'm mostly at peace with it now. I've had to make my peace with it. But there is one thing that still creeps into my thoughts on the rare occasions when it surfaces. The thought that somewhere out there might exist a video of me on my knees on a dark road, sobbing and begging for my life, and that a man who was never caught, never punished, might sit somewhere and watch it back. Reliving what he did. Taking pleasure in it all over again. If that's true, then he's still out there. And so might his other victims be. If you're finding comfort in these stories, knowing you're not alone in what the world can throw at you, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who might need to hear it tonight. Story 2, The Cleanup Crew. My name is Rick, and I grew up in Boyle Heights, pretty much the most Latino neighborhood in all of Los Angeles. My mom and dad had come up from Mexico before I was born, and they had me not long after arriving. Mom and I were always close. My dad was a different story. He walked out while I was still in diapers, giving my mother some version of the classic, just stepping out for a minute, line, except his version was that he was going out for beer. It must have been a very hard brand to find, because I've never seen or heard from him since. I dropped out of high school in the 10th grade. And I'd like to say it was for noble reasons, to help support my mother, but honestly, I was just exhausted by the whole thing. The teachers didn't seem to care that there were people actively trying to recruit me into gang life, and I was failing every class anyway. Rather than repeat years and drag out the misery, I quit and went straight to work. I did all kinds of jobs. Washing cars. Hauling drywall. And for a while, I worked night janitor shifts at a few warehouses downtown. That last one was the roughest. Some nights, I had to mop up what the drunks who slept in the loading docks had left behind, and I'll leave that to your imagination. But the warehouse owner was a decent man who appreciated hard work, and he'd sometimes slip an extra $50 into my pay when he heard I'd dealt with a particularly bad situation. That's where I learned something important: there's real value in being the person willing to clean what no one else wants to touch. So when a cousin of mine mentioned that crime scene cleanup paid extremely well, my ears perked right up. And I want to be clear, this wasn't anything shady or illegal. This was a legitimate, licensed private company that contracted with the city to clean up after deaths that required a professional, specialized response. Shootings. Stabbings. Overdoses where someone had been found in a sweltering apartment weeks after the fact with no air conditioning running. Once law enforcement and forensics were done with a scene, that's when we came in. We worked both private and city contracts. Starting pay was $22 an hour. Back when I joined, that was more money than I could realistically earn doing anything else, especially without a high school diploma. Add in hazard bonuses and overtime, and it was honestly hard to say no. I went to the office, filled out the paperwork, and after about a 2-week training course, I was cleared to start. The training covered blood-borne pathogens, biohazard disposal, which chemical compounds break down protein stains in carpeting, and how to wear a protective Tyvek suit properly so that nothing follows you home. The instructor was an older Korean man who had been doing this work for close to 20 years, and he did not soften anything. He told us plainly that about 1 in 20 people would walk off the job before the first week was out. That a third of us would be gone within a year. That we were going to see things that, unless we were completely cold-blooded, were going to cause us real distress. We wouldn't see bodies, forensics handled that side of things, but there would be blood. A lot of it. And sometimes things that used to be blood, or used to be other parts of a human being. It was hard work for hard people, he said. But if you could handle what you'd see, you could build a genuinely good living without so much as a GED. On my very first day, they paired me with one other new guy and sent us into a 1-bedroom apartment where a man had apparently shot himself in the head. The smell hit me before I even opened the door. I nearly lost my stomach right there in my mask. The masks we wore were cloth, not gas masks, so the smell came through regardless. That was the day I discovered the trick of plugging your nostrils with a bit of Vaseline before going in. It was the only way. We got the job done. We cut out the saturated carpet, scraped the walls, applied the enzymatic solution that breaks down biological material at the protein level. The whole thing took 6 hours. When we were finished, the apartment looked like nothing had ever happened there. I felt seasoned after that first day in the way that only truly difficult work can make a person feel. About 6 months into the job, I was on a regular crew with 2 guys named Choi and Randy, and our supervisor Frank. Frank was old school, another 20-year veteran, and while he had his own particular brand of crazy, he was a solid person and an excellent worker to have alongside you. Experience counts for an enormous amount in that kind of work. It keeps things moving efficiently and keeps everyone safe. Safety, in a job like ours, is everything. But on this particular occasion, Frank wasn't available. We could still take the job, we'd just be doing it a man down and without his wealth of experience. We got word that forensics would be wrapping up at around 3 in the morning, so we all met at the depot at 2:30 and rolled out shortly after. Some nights the job is simple, hosing down a small amount of blood from a contained area. Other nights you're dealing with an entire apartment full of drug paraphernalia and weeks of neglect. This particular night seemed like it was going to fall into the easier category. We'd been called to clean an alleyway where a young woman, a sex worker, had been stabbed and killed. On the surface, it appeared to be a relatively straightforward job, and we were grateful for that. We had no idea how wrong that first impression would turn out to be. We arrived at the scene a little later than planned, which meant the officers guarding it were not particularly happy with us. We completed the handover, and then as soon as the officers headed off, we started suiting up and getting ready to begin. And that's when an older white man in a dark trench coat walked up and introduced himself as a local pastor. The three of us stood there and listened as he explained that he was the family pastor of the young woman who had been killed. He said that her family had heard the news and that he had been the first person they called. He had agreed to come to the scene on their behalf, because going themselves would simply be too traumatic and painful. The girl's parents, he explained, had lost touch with their daughter years earlier, when she was still in middle school. She had fallen in with the wrong people, become dependent on drugs, and ended up selling her body to survive. They would be seeing her for the first time in years at her funeral. In the meantime, they had asked their pastor to go to the place where she had died and pray there for her soul. The man seemed genuine. He carried himself with the quiet dignity you'd expect of someone in his position. He spoke thoughtfully about the girl's story. And after everything he'd shared with us, none of us had the heart to tell him to leave. So instead of starting the cleanup right away, we decided to give him about 10 minutes to do what he'd come to do. Me, Randy, and Choi went to find ourselves some coffee and something to eat. Well, not all of us, technically. Someone needed to stay behind and keep an eye on the pastor, because letting an uncredentialed civilian hang around an active cleanup site without proper protective gear was a liability issue that could cost us our jobs. But I'll be honest, I wasn't particularly concerned. This was a man of God, come to pray over the spot where a lost young woman had died. What was the worst that could happen? So instead of standing right next to him and watching his every move, I settled into the truck for a quick rest while Choi and Randy walked to the nearest convenience store. And then, on a whim, just a random impulse, I glanced over toward where the pastor was standing. He was past the tape. He was on his knees. I was already annoyed. Because that was absolutely not where he was supposed to be. But then I saw his arm move, I saw him reach his hand forward, sliding it across the ground right where the blood had been pooled. That was a serious problem. Not just because of the obvious question of why anyone would do that, people do strange things in grief, and I tried to give him that, but because of the very real, very dangerous health implications. There was no way of knowing what diseases that young woman may have carried. Blood at a crime scene is a biohazard. Full stop. I jumped out of the truck and shouted over to him. Hey, Padre, you can't go touching stuff like that. I figured that at minimum, the sound of my voice would get his attention and make him stop. But it didn't. He stayed on his knees. And then he brought the hand he had pressed to the ground up toward his face. I don't have the words to describe what I felt watching that happen. My old instructor would have been beside himself. And I was pretty close to beside myself, too. It was one of the most dangerous things you could do at a scene like that. So I started jogging toward him, yelling a second time for him to stop. He stood up as I got close. He turned around to face me just as I started to warn him about the risk he'd just taken with his own health. I don't think I got more than 3 words out before I stopped talking. Because there was blood around his mouth. On his lips. And the look in his eyes, it wasn't fear, it wasn't shame, it wasn't the look of a man who had done something terrible by accident. He looked happy. Genuinely, deeply, disturbingly happy. Like he had just done something he loved. I told him, loudly, firmly, to get away from the scene before my crew came back and I called the police. He started backing away as soon as I stepped toward him, which was a significant relief, because the last thing I wanted was a physical confrontation with someone who had a face full of potentially contaminated blood. But his expression didn't change at all. He was still pleased with himself. Still carrying that strange, satisfied look. As I kept shouting at him to leave, he didn't turn away. Instead, he started speaking to me. In a language I couldn't identify. It wasn't English. It wasn't Spanish. It had rolling R sounds and a lot of hard CH sounds, something that reminded me of Italian, though a man I mentioned it to later suggested it might have been Greek or something similar. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that while he was speaking, he pointed at me, index finger and pinky extended, with wide eyes and a huge smile on his face. Like he was performing something. Like whatever he was saying mattered to him enormously. Now, I want to be clear, I wasn't scared that he was putting some kind of curse on me. I don't believe in that kind of thing. What scared me was that he believed he was putting a curse on me. And that behind his strange behavior was something deliberate. He'd come up with this whole story, the grieving family, the pastor's role, the young woman's tragic history, and he'd sold it convincingly enough for 3 grown men to lower their guard and walk away. That wasn't the behavior of someone lost in a random, unhinged moment. That was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He eventually turned and walked away, still speaking in that strange language, still chuckling quietly to himself. I kept shouting after him that I was going to call the police, the paramedics, anyone who could help him, because after what he'd just done, he clearly needed help from every kind of doctor. But he just kept walking. Calm and pleased and completely unbothered. I held off on calling the police until Randy and Choi got back so we could get our story straight. The truth was that we'd let him approach the scene, we'd essentially allowed it to happen, and we didn't want to lose our jobs over it. We agreed on a version where he had simply run up while we were all briefly distracted, and we called it in. The dispatcher said she'd send someone to look for him, but since he hadn't technically broken any laws, the scene had already been released by forensics, so he was more of a nuisance than a criminal. The response would be to locate him and assess whether he needed a psychiatric evaluation. We all agreed that yes, he very much did. We cleaned the scene, talked about what on earth that man's problem could have been, and Randy made a joke about me having had a run-in with a vampire. It was funny at the time. These days, when it comes back to me, it makes my skin crawl a little more than it did in the moment. That's what happens when something like that gets time to sit in your brain and you keep turning it over and over, asking yourself why. Why would someone do that? What kind of satisfaction could a person possibly get from putting their own health at risk like that, from seeking out a place of death and deliberately touching it? I don't have an answer. I've never come up with one. What I can tell you is that what stays with me the most isn't the strangeness of it. It's the happiness on his face. The way licking a dead girl's blood off his own fingers brought that look of wild, private satisfaction to his face. That expression is something I've never forgotten. Story 3, The Castle on the Hill. My name is Andy. I'm a professional videographer, and my fiancée likes to listen to storytelling content while she cooks. I've heard some genuinely incredible stories from others, and while my fiancée, thankfully, doesn't have any of her own to contribute, I do. Because even though I've filmed in some of the most dangerous and high-crime areas of both the United States and the United Kingdom, and have spent considerable time in conflict zones all over the world, nothing, and I mean nothing, has frightened me quite like what happened one night at an old Welsh castle back in 2009. I should give you a bit of background to explain how I ended up there. Back when I was freshly out of university, I was advertising my services on Facebook and in local newspapers. The work I picked up was mostly entry-level stuff, weddings, sixth form dances, small events. Reasonable prices, decent clients. But after doing enough of them, even the nicest events start to feel repetitive. Sixth form dances, in particular, are their own special kind of adventure, not because they're dangerous, exactly, but because a drunk 17-year-old can cover a surprisingly wide radius with projectile vomit. And while that does occasionally make for a fantastically horrifying photo, the last thing you want at 1 a.m. is to spend an hour cleaning bodily fluids off several £1,000s worth of camera equipment. Weddings have their own version of the same problem. A couple of glasses in, and you'll always find someone who fancies themselves the next great director, asking if they can have a go with your camera, and then nearly dropping it on the flagstone floor of some rented country estate. So when I received a message one afternoon from a man whose profile listed him as a paranormal investigator, I was immediately intrigued. Same pay. Same hours. But a sober environment, a genuinely unusual job, and a man who claimed to hunt ghosts for a living. I was in. I won't use his real name because I know his family these days and I have no interest in embarrassing him. I'll call him Ray. It was the first non-silly name that came to mind. Ray came across as a little quirky in his messages, which you'd expect from someone who describes themselves as a paranormal investigator, but also quite warm and professional. He explained that the job would be at Kidwelly Castle in Wales, about 2 hours from where I was based, and that he was willing to cover my petrol costs and pay for a night in a local bed and breakfast, which he said wouldn't put much of a dent in his budget. Apparently he ran a large cleaning business during the week and used his weekends and spare income to pursue his rather particular hobby. I didn't believe in ghosts then. I still don't. But I reckoned that spending a night at a medieval castle with a ghost hunter and his crew would make for an interesting job regardless. And in a manner of speaking, I was absolutely right, just not in the way I'd imagined. Ray's team consisted of 3 people, himself, a personal assistant named Sophie, and a technician he introduced as Phil. I put technician in very loose terms, and I say this with all the affection in the world for the man, because Phil had an assortment of interesting-looking devices with him, things that claimed to measure air density or detect electrical anomalies, and when I asked how they worked and how they might help us find evidence of the paranormal, he gave me an answer that was enthusiastic but not exactly grounded in anything I'd call science. None of that bothered me in the slightest. Phil was lovely, just like Ray and Sophie, and since they were paying me, I was more than happy to point my camera wherever it needed to go and enjoy whatever the evening brought. I drove out to Wales on a Saturday afternoon, arriving in the town of Kidwelly on the south coast in time for a late pub lunch. Shortly after, Ray and his team arrived and we made the short drive up to the castle together. Kidwelly Castle was built by Norman invaders and is largely in ruins today, for good historical reason, as Ray was quick to explain. It had been the site of more than 2 centuries of fighting between the Normans and the native Welsh. Built, attacked, captured, recaptured, besieged, relieved, and eventually destroyed. A place soaked in centuries of human conflict. And while Ray was fully convinced that the ghosts of long-dead soldiers still reenacted those ancient battles on the castle grounds after dark, they weren't what we had specifically come looking for. The ghost we were there to find, and I'll apologize in advance for how difficult the name is to pronounce, was Gwenllian Ferch Griffith, a 12th-century Welsh princess who had led a rebellion against Norman rule. Ray explained her story as we made our way around the grounds, and even as someone with no particular interest in medieval history, I found myself genuinely drawn in. Gwenllian was a descendant of the High King of Ireland, and according to the historical accounts Ray had clearly spent considerable time researching, she was as striking in her courage and intelligence as she was in her appearance. Her words and her presence inspired men to follow her into battle. She raised an army and won several engagements in the surrounding countryside. But what the Normans always had in abundance, thanks to years of conquest and expansion, was soldiers. When Gwenllian and her forces finally marched on Kidwelly itself, the Normans were ready and waiting. Her army was soundly defeated. And Gwenllian herself was taken captive. What happened next, Ray told me in a quiet, careful voice, is where the story becomes truly dark. The Norman commander wanted to make an example of her. With her surviving soldiers gathered and watching, he ordered her execution. I had pictured a chopping block. An axe. The kind of swift, brutal ending that features in every medieval story. But that's not what happened. A Norman soldier drew a dagger and cut through her neck, slowly enough that she did not die quickly, but rather drowned in her own blood as the blade worked its way through. When the dagger reached her spine and couldn't cut through the bone, the soldier twisted it. And then pulled. Breaking her neck first, and then quite literally tearing her head from her body. By the time Ray had finished telling me that story, I remember thinking very clearly, no wonder her spirit can't rest. Ray agreed. He believed that her ghost still walked the castle walls, tormented by the failure of her rebellion and by the memory of how her life had ended. And he believed that Kidwelly was the most likely place in the world to find evidence of her presence. To my genuine surprise, Ray turned out to be quite professional about the whole thing. He had scenes planned out. He had little speeches prepared for different sections of the castle. He'd even organized brief rehearsals for what Phil and the rest of the team should do whenever Phil's instruments picked up any kind of reading. I was impressed. As the sun went down and we started filming, the whole thing had the feel of a real documentary rather than an amateur ghost hunt. The team were clearly having a wonderful time, and that energy translated onto the footage. We made our way through the castle grounds, Ray narrating the history of the battles, talking about Gwenllian's story, stopping at significant points to speak directly to camera. Were there any ghosts? No. No orbs. No unexplained readings on Phil's equipment. Nothing out of the ordinary whatsoever. But it was a genuinely enjoyable evening of work, and I found myself looking forward to watching the final edit. We eventually made our way up to the battlements. By that point, the accessible battlements were a fairly narrow stretch of walkway, protected by iron safety railings, reached by a steep spiral staircase that was both quite narrow and quite deep. Before we went up, Ray sent Phil to do a loop of the castle at ground level with his instruments, checking for any readings he might have missed. Then Ray, Sophie, and I climbed the stairs carefully, I want to emphasize that word, carefully, and began filming a scene up on the walkway. It was dark, obviously, but my camera light illuminated the battlements beautifully, and we ended up with what I thought was genuinely lovely footage as Ray gestured out toward the distant field below and spoke about the ghostly battles that locals claimed to witness on certain nights. I'm not a believer in any of it, and I had no opinion to offer on the subject. I was there to film, nothing more. So when Ray suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence and stared out into the dark field beyond the castle walls, I simply kept the camera on him and waited. With the kind of dramatic sensibility he'd shown all evening, I assumed he was building to something. Pretending to see something, perhaps, for the sake of the footage. But then his voice changed. Gone was the polished presenter's tone. In its place was something smaller, and genuinely uncertain. Oh my gosh. I see something. Sophie started scanning the darkness in the direction he was pointing, asking where was it? But Ray didn't answer her. He just kept staring out into that dark field with an expression on his face that I had not seen there all night. Something that looked, even to my skeptical eyes, like real shock. I looked out over the field myself, trying to see what he was seeing. There was nothing. Just darkness. And the faint smear of moonlight breaking through the clouds here and there. But Ray turned to me and said urgently to get a shot of the field, to point the camera out there now. I did as he asked. My camera picked up nothing. Just the field, and the dark. I held the shot for a few more seconds, then turned back to Ray and Sophie to catch what they were saying. Sophie was asking him what he could see. And without taking his eyes off the field, eyes that were wide and fixed and frightened in a way that I hadn't seen before, Ray started describing what he was looking at. He said he could see Gwenllian. Out there in the field, kneeling in front of her Norman executioner. Sophie asked again where exactly, and Ray, frustrated, pointing, said quite firmly, right bloody there. Sophie said nothing in response. I got the impression this was a practiced silence on her part. Perhaps she had been in this situation before, where Ray claimed to see something she couldn't, and had learned that the most professional thing to do was to stay quiet. I followed her lead and panned the camera back toward the field, in the direction Ray was still pointing. And then I heard him say, "It's her. It's her. No, wait. It's..." And then he stopped. I swung the camera back to him. And what I saw on his face stopped me cold. Ray looked terrified. Not dramatically frightened in the way that might make good footage for a ghost hunting video. Genuinely terrified. The kind of raw, stripped-back fear I have seen on the faces of soldiers in active combat zones. Something that goes beyond performance, beyond control. His face had simply lost the ability to pretend. And then, in a voice that was barely holding together, he said words that I have never forgotten. That's Ava down there. That's my little girl." He pushed past me without another word, practically running for the stairs, with Sophie calling after him desperately, "Ray, Ray, slow down," as she went after him. I tried to follow, trying to keep the camera steady, but they were moving fast and the stairwell was narrow and dark, and it was nearly impossible to capture anything useful. And then I heard it. A brief, sharp sound from Ray. Something between a cry and a gasp. And then Sophie screamed his name. Not called it, screamed it. The kind of sound that comes from a very deep and very sudden place of horror, high and ragged and piercing enough to make your blood run cold. And then the sounds of a man falling down stone stairs. The scuffling. The impact. Again. And again. And the terrible silence after. I stopped trying to film. I got down those stairs as fast as I safely could. When I reached Ray, he was sprawled on the staircase, motionless, with Sophie standing over him. And when I got close enough to see the full extent of what had happened, I understood why she had screamed the way she did. Ray had struck his head against the edge of one of the stone steps on the way down. Kidwelly Castle's stairs are nearly 1,000 years old, and while they've been worn smooth in the middle by centuries of feet, their edges in places are still sharp, still hard, cut from some of the most unforgiving local stone in Wales. Ray had hit one of those edges with the side of his head, and the result was devastating. Sophie's torchlight tracked down the staircase. There was blood on the stone. A lot of it. And when I looked at Ray, at his head, I saw something I will not describe in full detail, except to say that it was immediately clear this was not a minor injury. Phil had heard the scream from the grounds below and came running. He was the one who called 999. He was the one who sprinted back to where the cars were parked so he could guide the paramedics in. I had written Phil off somewhat during the evening, with all his strange little gadgets and his vague explanations of how they worked. But in that moment, he was the calmest person present. And without his calm head while Sophie and I were barely holding ourselves together, I truly believe Ray might not have survived the night. Sophie rode in the ambulance to the hospital. Phil drove me in his car. And when we arrived and spoke to the medical team, they told us that while the injury was severe, Ray had been placed into a medically induced coma to manage the swelling on his brain. His chances of survival were actually relatively favorable. I drove home that night with just enough peace of mind to keep the car on the road. But the story didn't end the way I hoped it would. In the weeks that followed, I kept in contact with Sophie and Phil, checking in for updates on Ray's recovery. And the news, as time went on, was not good. Ray had developed what his doctors called post-concussion syndrome, and it was affecting him badly. He was having significant trouble recalling the events of the recent past, including, crucially, the minutes before he fell down those stairs. He had no memory of what he had seen from the battlements of Kidwelly Castle. No memory of what had frightened him badly enough to send him running. Sophie told me that no one had told him the full story of what had happened. No one had told him that he had looked out into a dark field in Wales and seen his daughter. Because Ray really did have a daughter. A teenage girl who had died after a long and painful battle with leukemia, many years before the night we filmed at Kidwelly. And Sophie told me something that completely reframed everything I'd witnessed that evening. The reason Ray had become a paranormal investigator, the reason he dedicated his weekends and his own money to hunting for ghosts, to seeking evidence of something beyond this life, was because he was looking for his daughter. He was trying to prove to himself that there was something on the other side. Some way of reaching her. Some proof that she was still somewhere, somehow, out there. When Sophie told me that, I sat very quietly for a long time. I had spent the evening assuming that Ray's ghost hunting was an eccentric hobby for an otherwise successful businessman. And in a technical sense, I suppose it was. But underneath the equipment and the rehearsed speeches and the dramatic delivery, it was grief. Grief that had taken the shape of an obsession, grief that had led him out onto a narrow stone walkway in the dark, grief that had made him see, or believe he saw, his lost daughter standing in a field below a ruined castle. I said before that I don't believe in ghosts. And I still don't. But I believe in grief. I believe in how completely it can reshape a person. How it can make you see things that aren't there, feel things that logic can't contain, reach across the impossible gap between the living and the dead with your whole heart, over and over, for years and years. And I believe that whatever Ray saw from those battlements, real or imagined, spiritual or psychological, it was real enough to him to send him running toward it with every part of himself. Real enough that it nearly cost him his life. What do you think Ray saw that night? And do you have a story of your own, something strange, something frightening, something that has stayed with you long after it happened? Share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if these stories have found their way to your heart tonight, please share this video with someone who might need the company. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and we'll see you in the next one.